3000.
Tonight's episode, some subject matter and content may be distressing to some viewers, so viewer discretion is advised. I want to put out there that we're talking to a lot of different people on this show, and not everybody's views may be shared by myself or the 3000 podcast. Having said that, enjoy the episode. Cheers. What is doing? My name's Maloney. This is the 3000 podcast. I'm joined today by an individual, Paul Moda from the Wasp Files, probably most notably, but also has been in the entertainment industry for quite a long time. Is that correct?
Oh, look, I'd say I've skirted around the fringes of the entertainment industry. I've certainly done quite a lot in the 40 years since I graduated from film school, but yeah, never felt I was part of the industry per se. But I've been very prolific, done all kinds of stuff.
And we're going to get into a lot of the projects that you've got on the go, but what most people would know you for now would be the Wasp Files, I believe, and that is when you sort of do a deep dive into the tragic events of '96 in Port Arthur. How did that come to be your primary goal at the moment, to shed light on that sort of stuff?
Look, it's an uncomfortable journey, to be honest. I never expected or intended to be the creator of the Wasp Files, which is an ongoing series of film podcasts about the tragedy. My initial intention was back in 2016 to make a full drama feature-length film about what I thought everyone else knew, which was that Martin Bryant had gone down to Port Arthur and shot up the place with high-powered rifles. And like any good writer, I started to research the tragedy. It was,
sorry to cut you off, but it was going to be a very difficult thing to sort of approach in a tasteful manner because of the subject matter. Did you find that that was going to be hard, because it is obviously a sort of dark day in Australia's history?
Yeah, look, I won't say that it was ever intended to be distasteful. It's just very sensitive, even 29 years later after the event. And I found, of course, a lot of people were like, no, look, we don't want to go there. We don't want to talk about it. I took the film concept everywhere, overseas to the US, to the UK, and certainly in Australia, and everyone didn't want to touch it.
I could imagine, yeah. It's just one of those things that's just not spoken about anymore.
Well, they try to. I think I've always believed that you shouldn't brush things under a carpet, that particularly if there's an unresolved aspect to any kind of major tragedy, and this was one of the biggest in our nation's history, that it should be examined in the cold, hard light of day to be able to put it to rest. And that hasn't occurred.
Yep.
That's why to this day there is this ongoing controversy and debate.
Yep.
Because people all this time feel like they haven't got the answers to the Port Arthur Massacre.
Yep. So then about a decade ago, when you go to do some research, you start to say, well, this isn't adding up, that's not adding up. How long did it take you into your research journey before you started to see there was cracks in this story?
Almost immediately.
Right.
Because I dug very deeply, deeper than most. I didn't just accept what I read online. I wanted to speak firsthand to the people that were directly or indirectly involved. So I spoke to the police who were there, first responders, survivors, two of whom are very good friends of mine now, who survived the shooting at Port Arthur. People that grew up with Martin, who went to school with him, who went to prison with him. I wanted to get their perspectives and give them the chance to tell their story. And a lot of those people really came out with information that contradicted the mainstream narrative, and that does so to this day.
Yep. So almost immediately you started to go on a different journey than you intended, but you started to see that, hang on, no one's really looked into this, or if they have, it's been hidden away.
I just couldn't write the script that I wanted to write because I didn't have the answers. And the authorities have locked all the hard evidence down. And as we had no open trial, no coronial inquest and no royal commission for what was at the time the biggest mass shooting in the world by a lone gunman.
Not just Australia, in the world.
In the world at the time. I think there was one in South Korea that was pretty bad around then, but this was one of the biggest. And it, by law, should have mandated a coronial inquest or a royal commission or a dive-in deep investigation, and we just didn't have that. We didn't even have an open trial. So it left a lot of unanswered questions, which remain unanswered to this day.
So in the 90s, there was no precedent for what would happen if somebody did shoot that many people, because it had never happened before. But what inevitably happened was they said, he did it, we've got a confession, that's it, case closed.
Yeah, look, I guess we did have a couple of mass shootings. So in the 1980s, we had Hoddle Street and then we had Queen Street, and this was in Victoria. And that led to John Cain banning high-powered semi-automatic rifles. So I guess in some ways that was a precedent. But both of those events, they invoked a full investigation. There was an actual video walkthrough where Julian Knight had taken the police through the locations at Hoddle Street. So those events warranted a very in-depth investigation and judicial case, if you like, to be able to determine the guilt of the perpetrators. And it was the same recently with the Lint cafe siege that happened in Sydney. That had a coronial inquest. But Port Arthur, different case altogether, and that was in 1996 after Hoddle Street and Queen Street.
So how can they get away with that, essentially? Like, what? Because no one was asking questions, because he didn't have proper representation? How did it get to that stage that it just was, he's guilty, thanks for coming?
Look, I guess in the judicial eyes of the law, if somebody pleads guilty, you don't have to have a trial. You don't have to call witnesses then and present evidence. But my understanding is that the coronial inquest was commenced by Ian Madison, and then that was discontinued. And I am looking into the legal viability of that decision, because there were a number of coronial acts that were put in place. There was the 1957 Act, and then there was an amendment in 1995. However, the 1995 Act hadn't been, in essence, brought into effect until after Martin Bryant was sentenced. So technically, the coroner was still acting under the 1957 Act, which then determined that there should have been a closure, if you like, and that didn't occur. In essence, the inquest was quashed, and that was in great part due to our then Prime Minister, John Howard, at the time. And the idea was they didn't want the victims to be dragged through what they thought would be a show trial. But I just think, given the exculpatory evidence, of which there was a ton, and the amount of contradictions to the mainstream story and the criminal investigation, that there really should have been some kind of deeper dive into Port Arthur.
Yep.
Whether that's a royal commission or a coronial inquest, or at least an open trial.
For sure. So when you start to do the research, you speak to victims' families and even survivors as well? Did that happen pretty quickly, or was that a few steps down the track?
That happened in the earlier days. So I interviewed two very pivotal witnesses. One of them was a lovely, courageous lady who's since passed on, called Wendy Skewer. Wendy Skewer was an employee at the Port Arthur Historical Site, and she was there in the cafe aftermath, dealing with the most horrific carnage that you can imagine. And she was performing triage on some of the survivors, and covered in blood for hours before help arrived. And Wendy was a very tough-talking, no-nonsense lady who had a lot to say about Port Arthur. She has never been given the opportunity to speak on programs like the ABC's I Was Actually There. So I interviewed her, and that was in 2016. And I also spoke to a good friend of mine, Stephen Howard, who lost his wife tragically in the cafe. And the same thing, his treatment immediately
Was he
after.
present when it happened?
He was.
Right.
He wasn't in the cafe, but he was working in the immediate grounds, and his wife was working in the cafe. So he, at some point, had to enter the cafe and discover that his wife had been deceased in that manner. Very, very profound loss. And there was a lot of question, particularly because a fire exit door in the cafe, it was a government-run tourist site, had been nailed shut. And as a direct result of that, 7 people lost their lives in the cafe because they couldn't escape. Wow. They were trapped at the door and shot down mercilessly. And both Wendy and Stephen were adamant in calls for a coronial inquest on that process alone. The work health safety aspect of a fire exit door that was locked or nailed shut. Actually nailed shut. And that never happened. So, yeah, they're some very crucial witnesses that never had their say in court, never had their say in the media. Same with Graham Collier. Graham Collier is a good friend of mine. He was in the cafe and he watched the shooter walk in. He's a very observant, remarkable man, Graham. And the shooter came in and started firing, and he turned around to save his loved ones, pushed them to the side, turned back and took a bullet in the throat. It came out through the back of his neck, blew his teeth out, and he lay there drowning in his own blood. But he was playing dead and watching the shooter. And in his witness statement, and what he told me directly was the person who shot him was not Martin Bryant. And I said, "Are you certain?" He said, 100%.
And that's in his witness statement to the police.
That is. He has never been called as a witness in court, nor has he been interviewed on the media. So he was a crucial witness, and to this day, his statement is very adamant about the description of the gunman. He also was in the hospital recuperating, and the police brought in the identikit board, and he said, quote, "The photos were that fuzzy, you could have put a blonde wig on Big Bird." And he said, "Oh, look, I don't know, but this person's got blonde hair." And they said, "Okay, you've identified Martin Bryant." And he said, "No, I haven't done that. He's upstairs being treated above me in the ward above. Take me up and I'll identify him." And they said, "No, you don't need to do that."
Well, you could understand why they don't want him to see the person that may have shot his family member. That's, is that, yeah, I don't know.
I guess, look, some people would take that, but Graham was a little bit more stalwart about wanting to have say in what had happened to him and his loved ones. And he was adamant that he wanted to have a more comprehensive identification of the person who came into the cafe and was not given that chance.
Yeah, so I guess wherever you sit on this situation, I think everyone can agree that there wasn't enough done to sort of see what actually happened. We just sort of said, this is what happened, get over it, move on. Whether or not you believe it is Martin Bryant or isn't, people must agree that not enough research has been done to what actually happened.
Yeah, look, reading between the lines, of course. I'm not saying that Martin Bryant was not involved and perhaps didn't even do the shooting. I'm here, as I've always said, to ask questions. And I don't believe there's anything wrong with asking questions. I find the term conspiracy theorist and tinfoil hat wearer repugnant. I prefer to use the term alternate narrative. And my belief has always been, from a scientifically minded point of view, that there is nothing wrong with asking questions, particularly in the absence of information.
Yep.
Now, of course, if Martin Bryant was the shooter, and I spoke to the New South Wales Forensics Police who, quote, crawled all over that cafe. They got the DNA, the fingerprints on the food tray that he consumed a meal with, the ballistics, the shell casings, discarded magazines. They've got the hard evidence that would comprehensively prove the identity of the shooter. Never seen the light of day, never seen court. There was also confirmed reports that the shooter went into the cafe with the gun bag and also a grey video camera case. There was also later on a leaked police training video where they panned across the cafe aftermath, and you can see the table where the gun bag is, where the shooter had sat and ate his meal, and there is a black video camera seated on that table. So presumably there's a possibility the shooter filmed his assault inside the cafe. But once again, that's been brushed aside. There's no mention of a tape in existence, who's on the tape, what's on the tape. That would comprehensively prove the identity of the gunman. And I've always said, look, if they want this controversy and debate to go away, they could do that overnight by releasing the hard evidence. It's been locked down initially from a Hobart Supreme Court ban for 30 years, which was due to expire in 2026. And then I found out that the Tasmanian Archives Heritage Office had placed all of the files, digitised them in their archives under the highest restrictive category, E75, Chief Commissioner's Eyes Only, for a further 75 years.
75 years.
75 years. That means till 2091. Most people associated with Port Arthur will be dead by then. And I'm thinking, why? If he's done and dusted and locked away and guilty, absolutely, I'll eat my hat. But why not release the hard evidence to put all this to bed? And they won't.
So before you've gone deep into this, have other individuals done a similar thing?
Yeah, there's been many people looking at it. You know, it's sort of 50-50 as to how many people believe Martin did it. There's certainly indications that he was the shooter, and he was certainly arrested at the Seascape Cottage where the siege had transpired after the Port Arthur historic site shooting. So he was there, and he was arrested, and certainly the kind of, he was a disturbed individual.
Because just a bit of background on him for people that may not be overly familiar, he did have a pretty low IQ to the point that he wasn't deemed to be able to look after his own finances, which I understand he had significant inheritance as well.
Yeah, I mean, Martin was placed on a guardianship order back in 1993 by the Hobart Supreme Court, in essence rendered, mentally incapable of managing his affairs.
Is that something that happens often, though? Or only for people with significant money?
I believe because he was having a lot of difficulties and he was diagnosed as having a low IQ of about 66. And he certainly had antisocial tendencies and had a lot of problems with his parents. So whether or not they had say in organising his affairs, he did inherit a lot of money from an eccentric heiress by the name of Helen Harvey, who was heir to the Tattersall's fortune. And they'd become good friends. And he spent a lot of time with her. They weren't intimate, but they were good friends. She was an older lady. And she died under interesting circumstances, of which Martin Bryan had been accused of taking part in. She died in a head-on collision in a car crash, and was known to complain that when they were driving along, Martin would wrench down on the steering wheel and almost cause the car to go off the road. And so that forced her to drive at low speeds. So they both were in the car, and there was a head-on collision, and she was killed. And Martin was quite seriously injured. He sort of fractured his neck and so on. But then as a result of that, he inherited quite a lot of money from her, something in the region of about $500,000. There was some talk that he potentially had technical claim to the Tattersall's fortune itself, and that there was 2 packets of shares worth $29 million, but that's not really been determined. However, he did inherit property and money to the tune of about $500,000, and I think his parents felt that there needed to be some kind of control over that expenditure, because he was very lavish and travelling a lot and buying clothes and walking around Tasmania dressed quite foppishly and flaunting his wealth, and of course purchasing firearms as well.
So he did have a taste for guns and that sort of military stuff.
Look, it's never been comprehensively determined. Yes, he did own firearms. A lot of people own firearms in Tasmania. It was one of the loosest states for firearm laws. And in essence, what's been confirmed is that he did own a Colt SP1, commonly known as the AR-15, 223 semi-automatic rifle, and also had an AR-10, which is like a higher caliber version of that rifle, and a shotgun. There were other firearms that were used during the Port Arthur siege, both at the historic site itself and in the Seascape Cottage where the siege took place. During interviews with police, Bryant denied owning those firearms that were shown to him. One was the FN-FAL .308, commonly known as an SLR in our country. So there was a lot of confusion about, there were a lot of guns also at the Seascape Cottage, and there was really an indeterminate examination of where those guns came from, who owned them. Martin didn't have a gun licence, but there is some, mystery as to the origin of the firearms. I've dug into that, so I know a little bit more about where the guns came from and how they made their way down to Tasmania. But the gun registers of the firearms dealers that were associated with Port Arthur have both been seized and never seen the light of day once again. They would comprehensively detail who brought firearms, when they came into the gun dealers' premises, who they were sold to, etc. Once again, information is not available.
So when you start to find this information is not available, do you reach out to try and say, hey, why isn't it? I'm trying to do some research, or are you just met with stone walls?
It's pretty much the latter. I've certainly been stonewalled. However, I am implementing, correct civil legal, requests for the release of information and questioning some of the judicial processes that have locked that information down. I don't know what my chances will be. I also tried to contact Martin Bryan in prison. I sent a letter with a self-addressed envelope saying, look, if you give me permission, I can come and visit you and talk to you. Because nobody gets to talk to Martin Bryan. He's locked away. And I didn't hear back for many, many months. And then I contacted Risdon Prison, where he's incarcerated, and they said, your letter has been seized as a risk to prison security, which means Martin never even saw it. And I appealed to the Corrections Minister, stonewalled there as well. I will try again. But in the 29 years since Martin's incarceration, and certainly his demonising by the mainstream media, not one journalist has ever interviewed Martin firsthand. No one's heard straight from his mouth. Did you do it? Why did you do it?
So, but there is a confession somewhere along the line, though, isn't there? Like,
Well, how do we go about that one? Martin Bryan's defence lawyer, and I use that term very, very loosely, was John Avery. He was brought in after David Gunson was removed. And John Avery was anything but a defence lawyer. So there were many examples where John Avery could have presented a robust defence for Martin Bryan, particularly with some of the lack of due diligence in judicial process, the fact that the mainstream media had stolen a photograph from Bryant's house and the next morning plastered it over every major newspaper saying, this is the man in the face of a killer. Now, that's illegal. He hadn't even been charged. This was the day after.
And that's almost grounds to throw the whole case out almost.
Well, certainly to question it, because there's no way you could have any kind of trial without there being a prejudiced outcome, because the entire world was basically told Martin Bryan is the man, Martin Bryan is guilty. That's one example. I have credible evidence that I am following up on with Amnesty International and most likely a human rights lawyer from the United Nations, that the confession that was provided by Martin Bryan was obtained under a protracted and sustained deliberate campaign of torture. And I don't mean a bit of mishandling, I mean torture by professionals. Of course, this has to be determined, but they are some very serious accusations. And I have a lot of evidence from people that were ex-guards and also ex-inmates about his treatment. Claims that, for instance, he would be wheeled into the hot water of the shower, handcuffed to his wheelchair, and, quote, you could hear the screams through the cell block, that he would have boiling soup poured down his throat, that he was beaten regularly.
Before the confession.
Martin held a not guilty plea for 5 months staunchly. He was kept mainly in solitary confinement with very little access to information. And after that 5 months, his defence lawyer went to his mother, Carleen Bryant, and said, look, you've got to help me to get Martin to change his plea to guilty. Now, she admitted this in her book, My Story, and in reports with 60 Minutes and so on.
Have you spoken to her?
No, I tried. I reached out. She said she went to the prison and told Martin that unless you change your plea to guilty, you'll never see me or your sister Lindy again. Result, Martin changes his plea to guilty. So it doesn't mean he didn't do it once again, but it certainly casts a lot of doubt on the veracity of that guilty plea or that confession. John Avery produced a handwritten supposed confession from Martin Bryant, which he sort of flashed on one of the 60 Minutes reports. I don't trust anything John Avery says. John Avery was later a disgraced lawyer. He went to jail for misappropriating clients' funds to spend on artwork. My understanding of him is that his reputation is not exactly sound. And I certainly think, as a defence lawyer, guilt or innocence, your job is to provide, innocent until proven guilty in a court of law beyond reasonable doubt. I don't believe there was we were in any way beyond reasonable doubt. And I certainly think that there were many occasions where John Avery could have defended his client, perhaps gone for an insanity plea, and he didn't. He sold him down the river.
So, with that guilty plea, that then means that they didn't have to have a trial at all. That's enough to just say he's guilty.
Absolutely. That's it. By the letter of the law, you do not have to have a trial, which means something like 200 or 300 witnesses would not then be required to be called to give testimony, or that Martin Bryant would not be able to be cross-examined on the stand, that they couldn't present hard evidence, ballistics, forensics, DNA, gun registers, whatever. It all just gets pushed under a carpet and he's thrown in jail and they toss away the key. There's just something wrong with that.
And it doesn't seem to stack up. So how many, he was just given life without parole?
Oh, consecutive life terms till the end of time. So that's it. He's done and dusted in jail and will die in jail. And look, people may argue, yes, that's the way it should be, because people who believe his guilt beyond doubt in their own minds think, yep, lock him away, we don't want to know his name, he should be pushed there and forgotten about. But I guess everyone is entitled, no matter how heinous they may be or the crimes they commit, they are still human beings with basic human rights under international law. So sometimes I kind of think, if it was someone that you knew, a sibling or your own flesh and blood, a child that found themselves in that situation, would you be really happy for them to be thrown in jail for the rest of their life and that there was never an open trial? You'd be going, I want the answers. I need to know 100%.
Yeah. And like I said, wherever you sit on it, it seems like it's just not just to just not have a trial or any kind of inquest at all.
It's odd. It's strange. I mean, most other crimes throughout the world, major crimes, have always mandated a very deep, in-depth investigation. And this was one of our biggest. So it just doesn't make sense to me that they can arbitrarily just kind of dismiss all of the required hard evidence that really should be aired, and even giving people their say. The people that I'm interviewing on the Wasp Files, they've never had their say. They're angry. Why didn't we have a coronial inquest about the door being nailed shut? People like Graham who have a difference of witness observation have never had their chance to say their piece, and there were many of people like that. Sure, many witnesses said they saw him, what they thought was Martin Bryant, a man in a coat with long blonde hair, and picked him out from the identikit board. But it's just, there's too many contradictions for you to 100% say, I know with certainty that the outcome of Port Arthur was the correct outcome. There's too many, and there's a multitude of them.
As you were investigating, you said you got stonewalled a little bit, but did you get met with people saying, don't do this?
Yeah, look, I've received a lot of death threats, and I've also been unofficially warned off by ex-police, ex-military to leave it alone. It's a very grim and unpleasant journey. I did want to state that I don't do this to be popular. I don't do this to make money. It costs me money. I didn't want to find myself down this path. So it's a bit of a thorn in my side in many ways, but I've got to see it through from what I've started.
Yep.
I do intend still to make a full feature film about Port Arthur. I did speak to Justin Kurzel, who directed Nitram, and to Stan, and I basically was, proposing the concept. And at the time, they were like, no, we're not interested. And then they went and made Nitram, which, in my opinion was, it was, pretty intense kind of drama, but it was a bit underwhelming and totally inaccurate. So they kind of did the cinematic version of sweeping any conspiracy notions under the carpet. But it was an inaccurate film. They portrayed him, for instance, to be this totally isolated, lonely character, and just neglected to mention that he was in love with a young woman by the name of Petra Wilmot 3 months before Port Arthur. and that she described him as being kind and gentle and looking after her, and that they'd gone out dancing the night before, spent the night together. This is literally the night before Port Arthur. So, he had a girlfriend. He loved animals. There was another side to Martin Bryant that often doesn't get portrayed in the media. They just like to put him up there as the poster boy for sadistic evil killer.
Yep. When you reached out to his mum, did she just decline? Was there a dialogue back and forth? Do you think that maybe you will get to talk to her eventually?
No, I reached out through her publisher because she couldn't be found. She was hounded from Tasmania. My understanding is that she now resides in the mainland, perhaps in Western Australia, and I believe she may have joined a convent. And I reached out through a publisher saying I'd like to talk to her, but there was no response. I pretty much got everything in regards to her perspective on what she went through from her book, My Story, which is a very personal journal of, what they were like growing up as a family, and that, yes, Martin had problems and they were dealing with that, but she was basically portraying that they were an ordinary family. Her husband, Maurice, sadly took his own life some months before Port Arthur, and there was some question as to whether that would have affected Martin's his own mental state. So they had their problems, but she in the book even stated that she felt guilty about allowing John Avery to manipulate her into threatening family cut off if he didn't change his plea, and also questioned whether he was the shooter, which she did on an interview with 60 Minutes, and there was some outrage and shock at that. But I think she's a woman that just wanted to put it all behind her, and she loved her little boy no matter what, as most mothers do.
Yeah, it is always hard, I guess. Even all these people that are accused of horrible stuff, they're someone's sons, they're someone's daughters, and it's hard to get your head around from a parent's perspective.
I've always said that. I mean, we look at our human monsters throughout history and forget that sometimes they are at some point some mother's little happy boy and girl, and whatever happened to turn them into a murderous killing machine, or someone that I often say, where was the help? Martin was obviously having troubles, and I've read all the psych reports, I've got them there. They're very nebulous. They kind of suggest that he had an Asperger's type syndrome, that he may have schizophrenia. Some of the psychiatrists said he didn't. There was no clinical diagnosis of psychopathy or dual personality disorder, that there were two Martins. They're very nebulous, but I just felt that there was not enough attention to, helping this kid.
Yep.
He tried very hard. Like most kids, he tried when he was young. He used to sell little knickknacks to the tourists, and he would deliver fresh vegetables and crayfish to the locals, and he was mowing lawns and trying to run a little business, trying to connect with people. His own difficulties made that very uncomfortable for him. He was bullied a lot. He was laughed at and ridiculed. So whatever happened along the way, I do understand there were some head injuries as well. I have read some material on serial killers which have pointed a lot of issues regarding some of our most celebrated serial killers, for want of a better term, with having very severe head injuries or lead poisoning in the environment. One book I read said that serial killing in the United States was considered to be one of the number one medical issues at the time, because there are a lot of factors that can cause people to become homicidal, which don't often get enough examination. The prescription of antipsychotic and antidepressant medication, which went up 400% in 1988. And I looked at all the mass shootings in America. Prior to 1988, virtually no mass shootings. After 1988, a rash of school shootings, and we had a prescription of those kind of dangerous drugs going up 400%. There's a lot that pharmaceutical companies should be held accountable to, with the ease with which that medication is provided to people that are a little shaky, rather than good counselling, mental health support. and an examination of their deficiencies and disadvantages.
And I think what does get glossed over and a lot of the time replaced with medication is talking about your issues and why you feel that trauma, which doesn't get done enough. People just tend to get medicated.
Yeah, I mean, it's just we like to think that we're in an enlightened era now and that there's been advances in mental health support. I don't see that. It's very obvious to me, given some of the tragedies we've had recently, where we had people like Gargasoulis commit rampages in Melbourne City. A lot of people are still not getting the help they need. I've worked as a licensed security guard on the street for many decades, and I've seen firsthand the individuals that are out there on the streets, and they're certainly not being looked after, and they are dangerous people, whether they intend to be or not. And we just don't get enough support for that. There's not enough understanding. Why does an 18-year-old kid, in even a place like America, decide to solve their problems by picking up an AR-15 and opening fire on their schoolmates? They're 18 years old. Their whole life should be ahead of them. Our youth is, unfortunately, we've created a bleak, nihilistic landscape of hopelessness and overindulgence in entertainment and technology, and we're robbing our youth of their soul. We're confusing them with gender politics, with the supposed rewards of a shining capitalist society, and they're slipping through the cracks, some of these kids.
Yeah.
The pressure is so great on people now, and is it any wonder that they crack? And then once again, we bring in people from sometimes war-torn countries, and we say, welcome, open arms, come to Australia, we're all multicultural here, and they dump them out in outer suburbs like St Albans, where I've worked, and it's like a third world place. And these people are frightened, they're traumatised, they have no support, no help, they form gangs, and then we have violence like we're seeing in malls where they're running around with machetes. We're not tackling the root cause of this at all. We're simply putting a Band-Aid on it. Oh, yes, guns are bad, ban machetes. It's bullshit. Absolute bullshit.
Yeah. Well, look, anyone can find any kind of weapon. If you take the machetes off the streets, they're going to find something else,
They'll go to their mum's kitchen drawer and grab a kitchen knife or grab a car leaf spring and sharpen it. What are we going to ban next? Sharp sticks? This is typical of our governments. They do not look at the root cause of the problems. And it's very quick to turn around and demonise people that, like law-abiding shooters, for instance, are law-abiding shooters. Little perspective on gun control. Prior to Port Arthur, gun homicides were on the decline. They weren't going up. And what the media are often hysterically quick to proclaim is that, okay, there's more guns in Australia now than there was before Port Arthur. On top of the 1 million unregistered illegal guns out there, there's 4 million registered guns. That's 5 million guns in a population of 28 million. So my question is, why aren't we being shot in droves? The homicide rate in 2023 in Australia was 247 people. Of that, 27 were gun-related. 27. And of that, the majority were criminals using guns against criminals. We don't have a gun problem here. No. Australians just don't resort to firearms to solve their problems. We know criminals can get their hands on firearms with impunity, but the media and the gun control groups and the government are quick to sort of, well, we need to have a solution to this problem. Quick, ban this, demonise that. I have no problem with gun control. We have some of the strictest laws in the country. Fantastic. Lock them away, keep them away from kids, ammunition separate from the firearms, lock them in safes, fingerprints, police checks. I don't have a problem with that at all. But I think this sort of knee-jerk panic, hysterical reaction to just, for the government to make it seem like they're doing the right thing it's just, it's totally unrealistic. And they're not dealing with the
root problem.
Yeah, and the people in our society that really need to be helped or, dare I say, looked at a little bit more closely because they are potentially dangerous.
Back to the Port Arthur.
Yeah, sorry, I went on my...
It's all about tangents, but I've got to try and bring you back because we're still talking about that. So I believe 35 people lost their lives.
Yeah, that's correct.
So even if it was Martin acting alone, is a person with an IQ of 66 capable of executing a plan like that, whether or not he planned it or whether he just went out to try and harm people? Can one person do that on their own with that sort of IQ?
I don't think it's just about IQ. In essence, when you consider the actions of the shooter, particularly at the Port Arthur historic site, and Martin Bryant's supposed proficiency with firearms and knowledge, they're two different things. People often say, oh, look, it was close range in the cafe, almost contact point, and that Martin used to own a slug gun and shoot birds. Now, I grew up in an era where every kid had a slug gun, and every summer we decimated the bird population. It wasn't, kids would come in and say, oh, I shot 25 birds this summer. It's a little different from shooting people, live targets, in a conflict or combat situation. So reports where the shooter was very proficient with firearms, very calm, very collected, very methodical. He was described as dancing. The way he moved was that he would spin, pivot, lift the rifle, acquire targets, avoid people trying to apprehend him. Most of the victims that were shot at the Port Arthur Cafe were taken with headshots. The rifle was fired from the hip, not from the shoulder, where you would get more accuracy. There was a scope on the rifle, which, once again, it would be very hard. You'd need more time to acquire through a scope. This shooter was using hip shooting techniques very, very effectively in a very short amount of time. Aside from that, there is the physiological and psychological aspects of conducting some kind of major assault like that. There's the rush of adrenaline, there's emotion, there's panic, people screaming, unpredictable activities that you're dealing with. And on top of that, there's the magnitude of the crime itself. There were multiple staged events. The shooter went from the cafe to the buses, then to the toll booth where he commandeered a vehicle, where he took hostages, then he had the siege. That this is all planned in advance or improvised on the fly very, very effectively. Decoying the only two police that were close to Port Arthur away from the site on a wild goose chase. They got a report there was drugs at the coal mines over in Saltwater, and they drove all the way over there to find jars of soap powder. Once they go over there, bang. You think that's pretty clever for someone with a 66 IQ. There were tactics that were employed during the siege at Seascape Cottage that seemed to suggest military training. So there is a marked difference between Martin Bryant's familiarity with firearms, his ability, his eye-hand coordination alone. He was a left-handed shooter, which he demonstrated during a police video, but all the witnesses said the shooter was right-handed. Once again, contradictions in terms, contradictions that we don't have answers to. So it's a lot more complicated than just pulling a trigger. I've been a shooter my whole life, and I know very much that even at close range with firearms, it's very easy to miss. Just a matter of a few degrees can make the difference between you hitting a target and totally missing it.
Mm-hmm. So is it plausible that there was multiple shooters? Is that what you're sort of leaning towards when you break the whole thing down?
Look, I've always said I'm not alleging anything. I'm certainly asking questions, and I would suggest that there are strong indications that there were more than one shooter, particularly at the Seascape Cottage. At one point, there was a record of the police negotiation that took place between Martin Bryant, and it was him, who was calling himself Jamie. It was like he was sort of playing the role of a terrorist, and he was talking to police negotiator Terry McCarthy, who I spoke to at great length. And Terry was saying, look, the conversation was strange. He even put this in his own statements, that he wasn't acting like someone that had just committed something like this, and that he was saying very strange, odd things.
But it has been known that he may be schizophrenic, though he may have those tendencies.
Well, very possibly. So it was just very... I guess people often say that somebody with Asperger's can function at a higher level, but they act in some ways emotionally very inappropriately. So they're known to be reckless, to laugh at events that other people might find unpleasant. Once again, that could be the case, but without a thorough determination in a court of law or a forensic evaluation that we all have access to, who knows? But in terms of multiple shooters, the police were reporting that there were multiple shooters at the Seascape Cottage, and that there was also, during the Broad Arrow Cafe, there was reports that a shotgun had been discharged that direct survivors, and one of the surgeons at the Hobart Hospital had reported pallet damage, shotgun pallets. But the ballistics report didn't mention anything about a shotgun being fired, only the 2 rifles, and that a shotgun was discovered in the boot of Martin Bryant's abandoned Volvo. So there was a shotgun present, but whether or not there were other shooters, look, it's yet to be determined. It's certainly something that needs to be considered.
Yep.
And then we get to the tricky notion of, if it wasn't Martin, who and why, and would the government do anything? So I assume that's your next question.
Well, yeah. Also, even if he did act alone, was he coerced? Was there anybody who pushed him to this point to do it? Because he obviously isn't overly intelligent, so he's easily manipulated.
Look, when you look at the character of Martin Bryant, you say, okay, this is obviously a disturbed young man, and he had some traumas. He lost his father, and he had the crash with Helen Harvey. He came into a lot of money, and he had access to firearms. He was of low IQ and perhaps had some serious mental deficiencies that could be Asperger's, schizophrenia, etc. In my opinion, that could make him the perfect patsy. There were reports that he had a relationship with police, that he was taken on exercises, that in essence he may have had some kind of grooming, if you like. And this is all just, once again, it is just an alternate narrative. It's something just to consider and ask questions about. Doesn't mean it's the case. And that a person like that could be fooled or tricked into taking part in what he thought was an exercise. At the time, there were SACPAV exercises taking place on the Tasman Peninsula. SACPAV is the Standing Acting Committee on the Prevention Against Violence. In essence, counter-terrorism exercises. This was in the months prior to Port Arthur. We had tactical SOG police and supportive elements of the Australian Defence Forces carrying out exercises in Tasmania, coincidentally. So the theory or the notion is that he may have been tricked into taking part in what he thought was an exercise and stationed at Seascape and said, look, you will play the role of Jamie, who he was calling himself, and you will have taken hostages and you will be shooting out the window with firearms, but don't hit any police, because no police were killed. They were certainly shot at from the Seascape Cottage, but none of them were killed. And that the notion is that they may have sent someone impersonating Martin in with his Volvo, with his guns, who was a professional who went into Port Arthur and shot up the site and then came back to the Seascape Cottage, and the cottage was set on fire, and Martin was meant to perish in the fire, but he woke up on fire and ran out and was arrested. So that's kind of the loose notion of if there was an alternative narrative that involved shady aspects of the intelligence agencies, rogue tactical police, and perhaps government, that's what could have occurred.
But it just leads you to the question, why? And I know that seems so simple, but it's just, what is the motivation for that, though?
Look, I respond to that quite a bit. A lot of people say, oh, Port Arthur was done for gun control. And I say, no, that's way too puerile a motive. We know there are more guns in Australia now than before Port Arthur, so that didn't work. We can't get semi-autos and pump-action shotguns, but you can certainly get some very sophisticated weaponry still. I often say anyone who studies history, and if you don't, you should, only has to look back into over the centuries for governments, tyrants, dictators, despot rulers. The oldest motivators in the book: power, money, influence, and control. There's always someone that benefits from a mass trauma event, particularly war. The military-industrial machine makes billions from war. Events like 9/11, which have certainly been questioned in great detail. The owners of the World Trade Centers apparently had taken out massive insurance policies on the buildings, and that a lot of people didn't know that those buildings, most of the floors were condemned. They were full of asbestos. They were uninhabitable. So the collapse of the buildings certainly enabled a large payout. And then you had some very draconian and severe control mechanisms put in place. Now they can seize offshore funds in offshore bank accounts, hold people in places like Guantanamo Bay without trial for much longer, increase surveillance, cameras, CCTV everywhere, snooping into people's social media, control. Greed, of course, is one of the greatest viruses that affects human beings. There are people that just, with impunity, will step on others and crush their rights for greed, so they can rise within their own realms of fortune. Power, of course. John Howard, after Port Arthur, became our Teflon PM for 4 terms. He was renowned for taking the staunch approach to gun control.
Can you serve 4 terms?
I think he did. I'm pretty sure it was 4 terms.
Okay.
Am I right?
I was young then, so yeah.
I remember him. He was around for a long time, and and he was our stalwart PM, Teflon PM, and so power is a big thing. People can often, they can climb to higher positions of authority as a result of events because of their actions during the events. There's a principle which is I think it's called Heidegger's principle, which is reaction solution. No, I'm sorry. It's event reaction solution, and the notion is that what they do is there is an event that's created which people react to, usually with fear, and then the government basically steps in and says, "Look, don't worry, we have the solution." And people go, "Thank you," and then they comply with their government. COVID is a great example of that. I mean, whether you believe it or not, one of the guiding principles of governments is fear control. Fear control. Do this or else. Wear your mask or else, or anything really. There's always been these elements where there's a climate of fear, and we're afraid of our authorities. We're afraid of what could happen with war, with all sorts of things, and we rely on our governments to do the right thing, to make us feel safe, and then we comply with those instructions. So, whether you believe it, maybe it sounds like I'm going a bit conspiracy on that, but I just think it's quite evident going back through history.
It is, even with your largest tinfoil hat on, it's hard for normal people to sort of get their head around. There's people out there that would do something and take people's lives for the sake of greed and control. It's really hard for a normal person to sort of comprehend that, isn't it?
Well, to consider an outrageous notion that a government or shady elements within the governments would orchestrate something as heinous as Port Arthur to kill men, women and children for some kind of political or power agenda. And of course, it's outrageous to consider that. But that's the thing, not to quote Adolf Hitler, but he said the bigger the lie, the more people believe it. So, and I guess with the Nazis, there was the famous Reichstag fire in World War II where a government building was firebombed and they blamed it on the communists. And that was a deliberate false flag by the emerging Nazi party to be able to pinpoint the enemy as being communists. So false flag operations, for want of a better term, once again, look at your history. That takes place, that there are people that will pull the wool over the mass population's eyes to get away with all kinds of crimes. It was interesting to me with 9/11 that many, many years later, under the Obama government, they quietly released a statement that survivors from 9/11 could sue the Saudi government directly for the losses incurred from 9/11. And I thought, well, wasn't it Al-Qaeda? How come we can now sue the Saudi government? So you just have to look at sometimes, we also know that you can look up the statistics yourself, you don't have to take my word for it, but there are governments that have disarmed their populations and then murdered them in their millions. So, they're actually saying, they're saying now, even with Iran, that there could possibly be a regime change due to the actions of the US and Israeli governments, but that one of the reasons in the 40 years that the Ayatollah has not been overthrown is that they've disarmed the Iranian people. Iran used to be a very, almost westernized and democratic country, and then once the Ayatollah took over and introduced the Shiite law, that it became very, very brutal, a very brutal oppression of the civilian population. They were, murdered, and women, of course, if they showed a tiny bit of skin, were treated very harshly, and there was no way to fight back because they were disarmed. That doesn't mean we need to have a gun under every pillow, but it's just a historical fact that there have been some not very nice governments, and by removing firearms from their populations, then they can go, right, now we're going to do this to you.
So with this situation in Port Arthur, what do you want to get out of it? You want them to investigate it? You want people to become aware of it? Now that you're this far deep, what's your motivation moving forward?
Look, I've just sort of, my real plan is to just educate people on what they don't know about Port Arthur and to ask questions. I'm not here for any kind of grandiose end goal. Yes, I would like them to release the hard evidence. And I've said this, if they basically release that evidence and it's all, yep, it was Martin Bryant, he was guilty, he did it, I will eat my proverbial hat. I'll get on social media and say, look, I'm an idiot, I got it wrong. I'm not open to criticism. But I want people to be able to just ask questions. There's nothing wrong with asking questions. And when the media just rip you to pieces for daring to do that, what gives them the damn right? We're supposed to look up to our media as being objective, fair and balanced, and they've been anything but that. And I just find that most of the detractors, I'd say 99% of them that comment on the Wasp Files are rude. They'll just go, oh, you're a bunch of tinfoil hat-wearing cookers and you're idiots. And it's like, give me some reasoned debate. Have at me. Debate. I'll ask questions, you can counter. That's all I'm asking.
Yep.
This kind of knee-jerk reaction thing, emotive response is just, childish.
You mentioned earlier that you had spoken to people that knew him from prison. What do they say he's like in there? Does he converse with them and talk about it, or is it just not spoken about? Like, what's the interaction with him as a prisoner?
Well, once again, I'm getting a lot of information that suggests that what the mainstream media are presenting is not the case, that he's quite a polite, non-violent person, that if there's an altercation in the jail, he just walks away from it.
Is he in segregation or anything, or is he in general population?
He's housed now permanently in the psychiatric hospital, which is on the grounds of the Risdon prison, so he doesn't really mix with the general population. So ostensibly he spends his time in there, and he's heavily drugged, spends a lot of time sleeping. He has gained a lot of weight. And, once again, there was this, interestingly, that the Wasp Files has really gained a lot of momentum and traction. And then suddenly the media had this recent flurry, just the last week or so, of all these, Martin's, so obese that he needs 3 mattresses to sleep on, and, just this kind of, and coming out with shocking new information as to his motivation, which is not new at all. They haven't come out with anything new, but they've suddenly reinvigorated the demonising of Martin Bryant, which I thought was very interesting timing, given the Wasp Files. But people I've spoken to who spent time with him in prison said he's very controlled, so that he's always shadowed and watched by the guards. And the notion is that all of them, of course, go up and say, "Why did you do it?" And he said to a couple of inmates that I've befriended over the years, he said, "I did." He admits he was involved. To one of them, he said, "I admit that I killed the Martins, but I didn't do Port Arthur." And when he was asked who did, he got very frightened and said, "Men in blue overalls," and wouldn't say any more. That sometimes I've heard that he will come in and sit down and proclaim loudly, "Oh yes, when I shot them and I shot these people." But the impression I get is that he's almost forced to play the role, otherwise he gets punished and gets privileges taken away. Once again, it's, until anyone can sit down on a public access and speak to him and hear firsthand and really question him, are we getting the full story? Are we getting lies? Are we getting hearsay from prison guards and inmates? I'm asking questions.
Yeah, and I totally get that. But if he is someone with a very low IQ who's heavily medicated and may or may not have schizophrenia, are you going to get a straight answer out of him? You don't know what you're going to get if you did sit down with him.
29 years later, very unlikely. He'll be a mess. And I imagine too that, God knows what they've done to him in that prison. Look, Risdon Prison is a black hole of a place. It's come under its own coronial inquest for the way that they were treating some of their inmates where they weren't provided enough mental health support. So there was suicides and deaths, and that was investigated in a coronial inquest, I believe in 2009. There was a report that there was a disturbing report. There was a trans inmate who considered themselves female who was just put with the male population and gang raped. And she had developed some severe medical conditions, and they had the chance to heal her, and she said, I don't want the medication because they're just going to put me back in there, and she died. So the evidence that or the testimony I've heard from some people in there regarding the treatment of Martin Bryant was that there was a lot of brutality, that there are, it's a life-threatening place, put it that way, and not always from the inmates.
As you've been going deeper and deeper, is there stuff that you keep finding out even to this day that you didn't know about?
Every day.
Every day?
People are now coming forward with information. I'll say a lot of it is circumstantial and hearsay. A lot of it is backed up by people that, were actually directly or indirectly involved. So they have some veracity. I guess in the absence of the information that backs up the mainstream narrative, you go, well, a lot of what I'm presenting is just as credible as anything else, because we don't have an open trial, we didn't have an inquest, we didn't have a royal commission, we don't have hard evidence, we don't have testimony direct from... So whoever goes out there and says, yes, Martin Bryant did it, and there's no question, you go, really? Well, that's quite a leap of conjecture. You don't have access to the information, and yet I'm a conspiracy nut. And I've dug for 9 years now, very, very deeply. I'm probably more of an investigative journalist than most of them out there.
Yep. And before that, would you have considered yourself, for lack of a better term, a conspiracy theorist? Were you entertaining things like that, other truths that out there, alternative truths, as you call them?
No, never. As I said, I hate that term. I think we know that term, which has been around since the 1900s, was brought to the fore by the CIA in the 60s, specifically to discredit anyone questioning the Warren report on JFK. That was the CIA's use of conspiracy theorists. So once again, the government went, here's a catch cry for you to use to discredit people asking questions. My answer to people that just attack anyone that questions any major event is do your research. Don't just spit out what 60 Minutes tells you. Or what you see even online. Dig deep.
Yep.
Do the research. Then come and talk to me.
Because there's a lot of crap online as well. A lot of shit,
Look, nowadays we know that it's almost impossible to know what to believe. I know that the mainstream media works in step with the government. They've got a sort of a love-hate relationship where the government says, we need to do this, so you report that, and then we can say that that's what the media says and the public says, therefore we'll implement this policy. And then, they'll say, okay, we need to attack the government a little bit, so you let us do it. It's a relationship. And we're just fed whatever they want us to eat. So a lot of the social media alternate voices that have come out there gain a lot more credibility because at least they're asking harder questions and not just accepting what's been blindly fed them.
And I think that's the biggest thing to take away from this is whether you believe that he did it, whether you believe he didn't do it, whether you ask the questions about everything. You know what I mean? We needed more people asking questions about COVID, which they didn't. We needed more people asking questions. Just ask the questions. That's the biggest takeaway from it.
It is. And I just think, I'm certainly not a person that will see a conspiracy under every tree. I have a very scientific mind in that regards, or a logical, rational mind, and I'm looking for the facts and the truth. And so when they lock it away, that does make you suspicious. You go, why can't I see it? You're supposed to be working for us, not the other way around. What gives you the right to lock something down till 2091? So yeah, question and do your research. And look, if people out there want to just accept what's told them and just say that's the narrative, that's fine. That's your prerogative. But then you don't have the right to criticise people like myself or anybody else, really.
Yeah, and you're putting yourself out there. You're not got nothing to gain from this, and like you said, it's been trying. I could imagine that now, since you've got that profile with the Wasp Files, people are sort of reaching out saying, hey, have you heard about this theory, talking about other things and trying to get you to investigate other things?
Yeah, there's a bit of that. They're looking at all kinds of things like Ivan Milat, mass killings and cases of injustice where people were supposedly accused of crimes they didn't commit. I'm pretty busy with this and other projects. So, but what I admire is people questioning. I was always brought up that way by my father, just to question things. And there's always two sides to a story. We know that. Yeah.
There's a good quote that there's three sides to every story. There's their side, there's your side, and the truth.
That's a good one. And that's trying to discern that from this current morass of media proliferation on all fronts is virtually impossible.
Yeah. It must be hard with something that is so, even 29 years later, with the families of the deceased and the survivors that were there, doing this in a way that is not going to get them offside. Because I'd imagine there'd be people that did lose family members and are like, don't do this, don't bring this up, it's too much.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I've reached out. I've copped criticism from some of them, and I've reached out saying I'd like to talk to you, and they're not interested, and I understand that. I mean, their experiences are their experiences, and I have put the call out. I will talk to anyone. So, as I said, have at me. Come on board and shoot me down. I do have some interviews coming up with people that I've developed a bit of a relationship with that just poo-poo any notion that there was any kind of alternate narrative. And that's fine.
Yep.
Because I'm here just to seek answers, so I want all the perspectives. But some people, they want to bury Port Arthur and they don't want to know about it. To me, it's a boil that hasn't been lanced. And until they do, people are always going to ask questions.
And you still have the intention of turning it into a film?
Yes, very much so. I would like to. I guess the film concept that I want to do now is sort of a bit like Oliver Stone's JFK, where you have a central character taking audiences through the event and saying, okay, well, this is what the mainstream is saying, but then there's this incident, and have a reenactment of that, and then compare the two, and then let the audience make up their own mind. It'll be a bit of an antidote to Nitram, which is the dumbest movie title I've ever heard. It's just Martin spelt backwards. Say his name, Martin Bryant.
Because of legalities, was it?
No, it's because they were taking an emotional response of saying, "Oh, we don't want to mention his name." I just think that's puerile.
Okay, yep.
We all know who he is. I mean, it's very important. We do know that with a lot of serial killers and mass killings, everyone remembers the name of the perpetrator, but they never remember the names of the victims. There was a time when I knew them off by heart in 2016, and I'm at pains very much with a lot of the posts on Port Arthur to show my respects to the survivors, the families, the people that lost their lives, and have the highest respect for the police and first responders. There was a lot of fallout from Port Arthur where they lost marriages and some committed suicide, so the toll actually kind of went on from Port Arthur. It blew a hole through the whole of Australia.
Yeah.
And I do care. I do care very much about how people think. It's hard because, yeah, there's a lot of pushback against what I'm trying to do.
Where you do intend to make the film eventually. It's going to be a biopic or a documentary?
It'll be a feature film.
Uh-huh.
Though I am on the heels of Wasp Files. I guess I am considering perhaps a true crime miniseries documentary, very much like the sort of thing Netflix produces. Just that there's such a wealth of information that I've now accrued that I think that it may be of interest. I'm not sure what this is going to take me. I've got other film projects on the go. I've got a horror feature film coming out early next year. It's all shot. So, I'm sort of doing other more commercial fare, for want of a better term. So I don't know. I don't know how long I'll go on with this or where it will lead. I'm just running with the ball at the moment.
Do you regret going down this rabbit hole?
Not at all.
Okay.
If nothing else, look, I'm not in this for the money. Money's certainly not my god. I'm not in it for the fame. Could give a shit about that. It's the work. The work.
Uh-huh.
And I've always believed no matter what you do, you've got to be able to look in the mirror and like what you see looking back. And I have, if nothing else, I've got integrity. I do this on the smell of an oily rag. It hurts me to do all these projects that I'm doing. I don't have money. I don't have a lot of resources and time. Certainly don't have time. I've got good people helping me.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard.
Yeah.
I've done this for 40 years.
With this true crime sort of stuff, when you look at the bigger media agencies, they seem to be fine with it, but when it comes to homegrown stuff, they don't like it too much, do they? So, like Netflix, would they pick it up and make it into a series?
I don't know. Perhaps. Possibly. I mean, they're certainly preoccupied with, like the Hillside Strangler and Jeffrey Dahmer and Manson and so on. Look, there's something about the nature of Port Arthur. It's a nasty, particularly grim and horrible crime. I can see why people don't want to in any way dramatise it. So is Dahmer, though. That series was incredible.
And that's one thing that we do forget. When it happens overseas, you just sort of think of it as more entertainment and that happened in a different place. But when it happens at home, it's a bit more close to home and you're like, oh, these are real families that are affected.
Yeah, not this little black duck. What humanity does not surprise me at all. And I guess I'm woke enough. I hate that term. I've awakened enough to know that it can happen to anybody, anywhere, anytime. And I guess I've always got that sort of sixth sense of danger, and that it's kind of hard to describe. But I'll take a boat ride down the Yarra River and look at all our beautiful buildings and on a sunny afternoon and everyone having a good time, and I'll be sitting there thinking, gee, we don't have bombs landing on us like in other places of the world, but one day that may happen.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favourite sayings is, don't be the last man standing at Kabul airport. Oh, don't worry, the government's don't worry, we'll get the planes, we'll get you out for supporting us. And then there are people clinging with grim death to the wheels of the planes and falling to their death. That's the reality.
Yeah.
You've got to be self-sufficient and look after yourself and never assume that you're safe. That violence can happen to anyone, anytime, and when it does, it happens very quickly. I've seen that firsthand as a security guard and a bouncer, and it's an ugly thing, but it's there.
Do you think that you'll continue with this investigation as long as it takes, or will it eventually run its course and you'll move on to something else?
Look, my plan is to pass the baton. Part of the endeavour is for me to create the resources library for Port Arthur, and it will have a lot of material which has never ever been seen before or not, genuinely available, generally publicly available. So it's taken a long time for me to get a lot of this information. I want it freely available, and that way other people who may wish to do other things will be able to go, cool, we've got this, rather than scrambling around trying to find things that have been, erased from YouTube and whatever else.
Yep.
They do try and get rid of material, but it's a bit of whack-a-mole. It always pops up somewhere, but you've got to hunt it down.
Does your content get flagged with that sort of stuff?
Absolutely. I get shadow banned a lot. Pretty much the only platforms that I put the Wasp Files on are TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. And it's interesting that, there's been a huge momentum and traction on the post, and then I've watched it kind of degrade a bit. And then some people have said, look, my comments are being deleted. And I've, appealed some of the decisions that were made, and they say, oh, look, we automatically delete comments that go against community standards. It is some question. You go, well, how much control is there over the information? I've always said that it's the real power lies in who controls the information, and are there larger forces that are restricting certain content that goes out on social media? Is AI basically subverting any notion of what's real and what isn't? And is the freedom of the internet still free? I very much doubt it. It's controlled. So, yeah, it's of concern to me that the greater the level of interest and subscribers, if you like, and it seems like the posts don't get as much traction. So,
with that audience, I'm guessing it's a lot from Australia, but is it globally as well? Like, is it focused mostly in Australia, or the audience all over the world?
Mainly Australia, but yeah, I have had people reach out. I've done some international podcasts with people in the US and the UK. So yeah, there are other people that are aware of the Port Arthur Massacre and that are interested enough to examine it.
I wonder, like, I often think about, because I loved conspiracy theories. I loved them.
Don't we all?
Until COVID, and then it all becomes a bit too real. But I feel like with the internet, people love to get down a rabbit hole. And that is a perfect one for people that didn't even know about it to get down, because they start to get deeper and deeper and deeper. And I wonder whether now that the term conspiracy theory is bounded around a lot, whether we've kind of ruined the idea of let's ask questions, and we've gone. People say we want to be conspiracy theorists, and they wear that hat. They wear their tinfoil hat with pride, and it kind of discredits what the research that could be done. Do you know what I mean? Your people say to you, you're a conspiracy theorist now, just because you're asking questions, and that's a scary place to be when it comes to like research.
It doesn't bother me at all, but as I said, those terms are repugnant, and they're also inaccurate. So anyone out there, please use the term alternative narrative, or rather than conspiracy theorist, free thinker, because we're thinking freely.
Yes.
We're not enslaved to someone that's telling us what we should think or what we should say or what we should believe. Free thinker and alternate narrative. Conspiracy theory, tinfoil hat, shove it where the sun don't shine.
The problem is too many free thinkers becomes a problem.
For who?
Well, exactly. Do you know what I mean?
Well, of course. I mean, anyone that's gains too much kind of liberty with their ability to influence people becomes dangerous. Very interesting one was can't remember his name. That's a famous actor. They call him the Shagger of the Year.
The Shagger of the Year?
Who was it? Should know his name. He's a British actor, and he's become a bit of a radical.
Michael Caine.
No.
Yes. His name is.
He was in Forgetting Sarah Marshall.
Yeah. Now I'm forgetting what his name is. Anyway, we'll chop that bit.
Yeah, that's terrible.
No, his name is Russell Brand.
Russell Brand.
There we go.
So Russell Brand, he was renowned, for being he was Shagger of the Year, and lay waste to the celebrity population, female population, and was lauded for being this kind of crazy, out there comic actor and performer and man of sexual prowess until he became an activist. Then suddenly he's up on sex assault charges, and he's a very messed up person, a very abusive childhood, and had drugs, and so had a lot of problems. But now he gets ripped to pieces because he's actually trying to impart information that's useful to people. Same with Dave Chappelle. Dave Chappelle's become such a well accepted and loved comic, out there comic, that when he does something and makes a comment about transgenderism. You know, he's viciously attacked, but I guess he has that popularity base where he can afford to double down. And so it is an interesting thing. You stick your head out of the pack and somebody tries to kick it. The mob tries to kick it. And I think the worst thing you can do in that case is to sort of kowtow and go, oh, I'm really sorry, I shouldn't have done that. I'll really apologise. So fuck that. Sorry to use the French, but this above all else, to thine own self be true, then it follows as night follows day, thou can be false to no man. Stand your ground. Stand your ground. Stand by your principles. If you make a mistake and you screw up, yeah, I screwed up. I made a mistake. Guilty. But, you know, to kowtow to a mob mentality or to some kind of accepted social requirement that you have to do or say or behave in a certain way, yeah, well, if that's the new generation, I'm happy to be part of the old generation.
Paul,
Old school is good school.
man, I think
Old school's the only school.
I think that is going to be a pretty good way to wrap it up. I appreciate you coming in, and I would love you to come back and we can talk more about your story and not just about the Wasp Files in the future if you'd be keen to do that.
Yeah, absolutely, sure.
All right, Paul, I appreciate you coming in. It's been a great chat, and what did you say? Stay true.
Stay true to yourself. Stay true to your principles, your beliefs, and then you can't lie to anyone.
Ask questions.
And watch the Wasp Files, please. Don't take my word for it. There are witnesses on there that in their words, not mine. So watch the Wasp Files and educate yourself.
Thanks for coming in, man. Cheers.
Pleasure.